SDGs in Curaçao. Join this virtual event from September 27th to October 1st, 2021. Participate in a week of inspiring roundtable sessions on the people, planet, and prosperity pillars. Contribute with your valuable input to complete the process for Curaçao's Voluntary National Review, VNR, and share your input on how to accelerate and implement the Sustainable Development Goals for Curaçao. Join us also for the SDG Academy, where we will discuss interesting topics with an international UNDP expert. And of course, don't forget to join in at the final event with our youth. The Curaçao SDG Action Week is organized by the Curaçao National Commission for the 2030 Agenda, facilitated by the Government of Curaçao. Mark your calendar from September 27th to October 1st, 2021, and join us virtually for the Curaçao SDG Action Week 2021. To register, visit our Facebook page, SDG Curaçao 2030. For more information, visit our website, www.curacao2030.cw. Feel free to get in touch with us through Facebook, Instagram, or any of our social media platforms.
Good morning, bonjour, as we say here in Curaçao, to our dear and valued participants. Welcome to the second edition of Curaçao's SDG Action Week 2021. My name is Richenel Ansano, and I'll be your moderator host for today's session. It's a great honor to open and host for the second time the Curaçao SDG Action Week. I have been involved with the process of SDGs in Curaçao since 2015, with the integration of the SDGs in our National Development Plan for Curaçao 2015-2030, and subsequently for the roadmap for the SDG implementation in 2018, and further implementation as a member of the Secretariat for SDG Implementation in Curaçao. For both trajectories, I was the project manager for the UNDP here in Curaçao. The SDG Action Week is organized by the Curaçao National Commission for the 2030 Agenda, facilitated by the Government of Curaçao. This year's edition, we will focus on our local stakeholders via roundtable sessions on people, planet, and prosperity pillar, and primarily also on stakeholder engagement and gathering input for Curaçao's input in the Voluntary National Review due in 2022. I'm also very, very excited to announce that this year we'll start with Curaçao's SDG Academy with capacity building sessions on topics regarding policy coherence and also monitoring achieving the SDGs. On our last day, we will have a session dedicated completely to the youth of Curaçao as a kickoff and brainstorming session for the establishment of our first SDG platform for Curaçao. Ladies and gentlemen, dear valued participants, our first speaker today will be the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Economic Development, Mr. Xavier Prents. So without further ado, I invite you to participate and join us for this year's edition of the SDG Action Week 2021. Enjoy.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants. Bonjour. It's both an honor and a pleasure to join you and to be part of the opening session of the second edition of the SDG Action Week. Both Prime Minister Pisas and Minister Saintje of Economic Development sent their regrets as they unexpectedly had to schedule a meeting with their fellow colleagues of the Council of Ministers. The peak public health impact of all things COVID-19 seems to be behind us, but the socio-economic and budgetary challenges it created are still very much determining our government's daily efforts and planning. My name is Xavier Prents, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Economic Development, and I have to confess, I have more than a soft spot for the global goals. Courtesy of a 22-year career as a diplomat representing our country in international fora, such as the United Nations and the World Bank. Diplomacy from a Caribbean perspective is all about sustainability. I'm therefore very pleased with the joint efforts of the National Commission of the SDGs here in Curaçao to organize this Action Week. What we offer you is a week full of interesting webinars, capacity building sessions, and roundtable sessions. We have invited a diverse set of stakeholders from the private sector, NGOs, academia, and last but certainly not least, also our youth. One of the key pillars in the Agenda 2030 for Curaçao is the prosperity pillar. This is also linked with one of the main accelerators in Curaçao's SDG implementation roadmap, the Accelerator for Inclusive, Sustainable Economic Growth. The COVID-19 pandemic, however, wreaked havoc on our economy in a way that is hard to fathom. It exposed underlying fault lines and magnified already existing challenges and vulnerabilities. And it created an almost complete standstill in the thriving tourism and hospitality sector, the economic industry that kept us afloat during the challenging times before COVID-19 made its way to our shores. Given the size of the economic hit that we took, we lost 20% of our GDP last year, in spite of sizable liquidity support from the Netherlands. Recovery will be a multi-year effort. But the groundwork is being laid as we speak. Groundwork for sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery. A fundamental rethink of existing governmental policies is required to get there. And the SDGs will certainly help us and guide us in this endeavor. The global goals are all about inclusiveness. One of the main principles being leaving no one behind, going beyond averages. The short-term socio-economic challenges will be enormous. The political pressures to solve them right here and now, even more so. We therefore will need to work on a recovery while also keeping a long-term perspective. Approaching the most pressing matters with short-term solutions, while at the same time focusing on our long-term targets, including economic diversification, an economic environment that is enabling for investment, both local and foreign, reducing vulnerabilities and fostering the well-being of our citizens. Our government will not be able to handle it all by itself. Partnerships are needed to introduce the required changes to, amongst others, our business climate. One that is more attractive and competitive for investors. One with less red tape. All of this is easy to say. And while we are pleased with the progress we have been making with some of the technical work behind the scenes, we are also very conscious that there is still a lot of hard work to be done. The policy, institutional, and enterprise levels. Even though the effects of COVID-19 were mostly adverse, some good did come out of it. As shutdowns and quarantines forced us to reassess life as we knew it, and the economy as we knew it, they also made us conscious of new opportunities. The potential that technology and innovation offer should be embraced as we aim to fortify and diversify our economic foundations and strive for an inclusive recovery. A recovery that will foster the creation of new and decent jobs for all our citizens. In closing, it's also incumbent upon us to include our youth as we embark on this journey. Us adults can be stuck in our ways, as my kids like to say. We need our youth's bright and creative minds. In the end, it's for them, for you, that us adults, ever so slowly, but increasingly so, are embracing the global goals and are aiming for a sustainable approach. One that allows us to realize the recovery and development we need now without harming or jeopardizing the needs and wants of future generations. There's only planet A, planet Earth. There is no planet B. The SDGs can help us create a common foundation for dialogue and understanding on our national priorities and issues, even across generations. I wish you well in your endeavors during this Action Week, and I look forward to working with you as we move forward towards a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. That was very nice to hear of you from the perspective of the government, but also when you enlighten us and focusing on the great deal that partnerships is very essential for the progress and advancement of SDGs. Also, the focus on the recovery. We know we had our challenges with the COVID-19 pandemic, but still we have to change our mindset and also focus on the road to recovery. Next on, we'll have our keynote address by Mr. Richenel Ansano. Allow me first to introduce Mr. Ansano. Mr. Richenel Ansano, commonly known here in Curaçao as Moose, was born and raised in Curaçao in Curapiedra, the neighborhood of Curapiedra. He studied economics at the Inter-American University in Puerto Rico and anthropology at the Rutgers University in USA. His principal areas of interest are the behavior of cultures, spirituality, cultural education, health, and in particular, Afro-Curaçaoan health. In the past, Richenel was head of the service of the cultural department of the island area of Curaçao and also the director of the National Archaeological and Anthropological Museum. In the United States, he worked as a social worker for the Puerto Rican Action Board. He was also the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute at the Duke University and also at the Global Medicine Education Foundation. Recently, he functioned as an expert of cultural heritage and facilitator for the Treaty of UNESCO to safeguard our intangible cultural heritage. In this capacity, he was an advisor for training and accessories for all the islands in the Dutch Caribbean, but also Jamaica, Nepal, Vanuatu, and Korea. He also supported UNESCO as an expert on cultural heritage regarding calamities and emergencies. Aside from his professional life and professional function in cultural areas, Richenel is also a healer for 4 decades already. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you now Mr. Richenel Ansano.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martis, for that very generous introduction. And I'm also glad to have been able to hear Mr. Prince's introduction that puts a very important context to what I will be talking about today. And I would ask everyone to please bear with me as I will be translating on the fly. Part of the beauty and power of being in Curaçao is to live in a multilingual community and to have both the strength and the challenges that come with that. So we'll see some of that in the presentation, I hope. I will start by sharing a presentation with you. I hope it is visible. Okay. Every day we wake up in multiple worlds, and today I woke up in a few worlds that I believe are important to mention when we talk about sustainability and the future of Curaçao. Today is the 200th anniversary of the death of Luis Brion, who was a freedom fighter for the countries in South America and the Caribbean. It has gone by without much mention, but his life and his fights within the Caribbean and also in Europe are part of some of the things that we will be talking about in terms of sustainability. At the same time, I don't have to tell anyone that we're in the SDG Action Week. So this whole week is dedicated to us thinking the future, thinking through a commitment that we've started since 2015 and even before that, and how to achieve those commitments. It's also Semana de Cultura, so it's a week of uh, paying attention to culture in many different ways. And with this year's theme of Conope, Halse y Traspase, it talks about continuity and sustainability in many ways. And finally, there's the world of freedom fighting on the island. This is the week that leads up to October 3rd, when the people who rose up in 1795 against a system of oppression were executed. These four worlds seem totally separate from each other. People who pay attention to them seem to be paying attention to just one world, and these others don't seem to be connected. Excuse me, but some of the links might take us to different ways of thinking about sustainability, different ways of thinking about culture, and different ways of thinking about management of our social processes. If I only think of Luis Brion and the Parque Lucha de Libertad, they're both close to the coast. And if we're talking about sustainability in terms of calamity, these are places that will be fairly soon covered by the sea if we don't take action. And there is power in thinking about history and identity, and how history and identity can be rallied to deal with emergencies. And in this case, how those memories can be rallied to work on dealing with coastal management in times of rising sea levels. But a fifth world in which I woke up today is the world of language. If we choose to use Papiamento, or if we choose to use English, what kind of perspectives do we miss? What kind of things do we focus on? What are the groups that are included or excluded from the dialogues that we have? These are some of the questions that I take with me into the rest of my presentation. And the central focus of this is, as an anthropologist who I dearly appreciate, Marilyn Strathern has said, it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with. We are starting this week with a history of commitments. We have already committed to Agenda 2030 in many ways, some that have been mentioned by Mr. Martis and by Mr. Prince. And that commitment to sustainability, to sustainable development, and to a set of goals related to sustainable development, to be able to implement those and to manifest those, we need ideas on how to do that. And we've developed many ideas around implementing the path to reaching the sustainable development goals. Some of those need to be questioned. Some of those need to be strengthened. And as we move along, we will have to keep developing new ways of understanding where we're at, and how to move forward. We start with a set of goals that have been established in 2015 when the United Nations announced their Agenda 2030. And in that Agenda 2030, they focused on sustainable development for the coming decades. To reach a specific target, to reach a specific vision of a future, they established 17 goals, sustainable development goals, and these 17 goals have multiple targets that are attached to them and that flow out of them. And we will be looking at some of these goals that are picked up by UNESCO. UNESCO does have a mandate to build peace, and building peace includes eliminating poverty, promoting sustainable development, intercultural dialogue, and to have all of this happen through education, science, culture, communication, and information, which are the fields of action of UNESCO. Within this mandate, UNESCO since 2015 has been looking at 9 specific SDGs, which are listed in front of you. So these are SDGs 4, 5, 6, 9, and 11, 13, 14, 15, and 16. These are very specific to the mandate of UNESCO, and UNESCO has been developing programs, projects, and different other initiatives that carry those SDGs and that implement strategies to accomplish these goals. Besides those, UNESCO is also contributing to SDG 1, the elimination of poverty, and SDG 10, which are not part of their mandate. SDG 10 is the reduction of inequality. But even though SDG 1 and 10 are not part of UNESCO's mandate, there are many ways in which UNESCO very concretely contributes to those, especially through what Mr. Prince had mentioned, leaving no one behind. And for UNESCO, leaving no one behind means especially focusing on Africa and women, because those are two global priorities in UNESCO's work, very much because these are two areas that do not receive the sustained attention in international programming. Besides that, UNESCO also works with least developed countries, with small island developing states, with marginalized groups and rejected groups, such as in cases of refugees, LGBTQ communities, and several other, I would say, social actors that do not receive the central focus that we need to give them in our programs. Of special interest in our case is the support that UNESCO gives to countries that are in conflict or crisis, and countries that are affected by emergencies and the resulting risks that come with emergencies. And their concentration is on building resilience in these countries and communities. One of the important issues with SDGs in the Caribbean has been that although UNESCO is involved both regionally and internationally, and culture is one of the pillars of UNESCO, culture has not been included in much of the sustainable development programming that occurs, and certainly not in emergency response and preparation. As I mentioned before, UNESCO does contribute to different SDGs, and SDG 11 is one of the examples of how this happens in the Caribbean, because SDG 11 is the promotion of healthy cities and communities. And in the Caribbean, UNESCO has especially approached that through heritage, both natural heritage and tangible and intangible cultural heritage. UNESCO also contributes to SDG 16 by protecting culture in situations of emergency. And this is meant to promote more inclusive societies, which is what SDG 16 stands for. But one way of thinking of calamities, of thinking of emergencies and their resulting risks, is to think through again what ideas do we use to think other ideas? What ideas do we use in terms of emergencies to think sustainability and to think uh, reaching goals that have been set since 2015? One of the issues with emergencies that keeps cropping up in the region is that we define emergencies island-wise. Most of the emergencies that we think of, be they their volcanic eruptions, be they hurricanes that we are so familiar with, uh, earthquakes, all of these, even though we talk about their regional impact and we talk about their regional origins, we still concentrate on island solutions when we think of dealing with risk. But we can think beyond that, and we should think beyond that. Uh, to start with, climate change, which does affect some of the more recent issues of emergencies, are is a global phenomenon. And we've dealt with the regional aspect of these by, for example, collecting donations for Haiti, for St. Lucia, for the Dominican Republic, when they went through the effects of hurricanes or volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. But we can think even beyond that. One of the things that happened recently was with one of the hurricanes that prisoners from St. Martin were sent to Curaçao uh, to relieve the situation there because the prison suffered damages and people were not able to be taken care of in that system. But that means that the system in Curaçao needs to be able to accept the incoming prisoners and be able to process them in certain very specific way. The same thing happened with school children who came to the island, which had to be taken care of. They had to go to school. They had to have a system of following their curriculum and following their learning goals. So each hurricane in the region affects us directly. So when we're talking about risk and risk management, uh, every year we very actively manage risks of hurricanes, even though the natural phenomena don't really affect us. And one of the ways of thinking through risk and emergency is to have this wider regional vision. Uh, Besides all that I have mentioned, we also have resources that we keep sharing with the region in ways that we don't think of. One of the small examples is social worker Guinness de Palm going to the Windward Islands and working with children, doing storytelling to help them go through the crisis, to deal with trauma, but to also deal with their own creativities that needed to be both taken care of and utilized in the community. Many other things happen during regional crises, such as we've seen with the pandemic, where there was there were different moments where bubbles were created between the ABC Islands for travel, but also we used each other's resources. For example, placing patients in each other's hospitals. Many other issues like that need to be taken into account in terms of a regional perspective on sustainable development for our local situation. In that sense, I want to highlight a few regional developments. The first one I would mention as a framework is the collaboration between UNESCO in the Caribbean and SDIMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. SDIMA has been doing an amazing job of coordinating disaster preparedness and response for quite a few years. And one of the things that UNESCO has been able to do is to collaborate with SDIMA to include culture in their framework. As I mentioned before, culture is not included in national emergency plans in the region, and this is a start for this to happen. SDIMA has created a guideline for establishing national risk reduction strategies that include the cultural sector. Many things have happened locally that feed into these developments, and I can mention a recent climate change policy assessment done by the meteorological department here, financed by UNESCO, and I'll come back to that. Also, within the region and specifically in Curaçao, also the Intangible Heritage Convention has been concentrating on emergencies and intangible heritage. When we look at intangible heritage and emergencies, we tend to think of how to safeguard, how to protect cultural sites, cultural practices in times of emergencies. But one of the things that the convention has developed is a view that culture itself is also a tool for risk management and risk reduction in general. And in that sense, several activities have been developed in the region, including in the Dutch Caribbean, an assessment on each island of traditional ways of dealing with emergencies and traditional ways of predicting emergencies. But I'll come back to that in a little while. The Regional Committee for Latin America and the Caribbean on the Memory of the World has also been doing several activities. The Memory of the World program is an initiative that looks at documents and cultural documents that have relevance for the region in this case. One of the things that the committee has done is to start an observatory to keep track of collections in the region and to be able to assist and send out alerts when collections are threatened due to emergencies. We have also done a extensive survey in Latin America and the Caribbean on the status and state of the different collections and documentary heritage sites that exist in the region. The Caribbean Association of Archives, CARBICA, has also done a tremendous job of bringing together actors, stakeholders in the emergency sector, and created the Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network, which is presided at this point by Max Krivonek, who is the director of the Curaçao National Archives. The Heritage Emergency Network brings together people who can respond to emergency situations related to documentary heritage. Similarly, in World Heritage, and as you all know, Willemstad is one of the World Heritage sites in the Caribbean. Uh, World Heritage also deals with emergency, and right now there is a project running for updating the management plan of Willemstad as a heritage site, and part of that updating includes emergencies. It's specifically done to make sure that the emergency aspect is taken care of. And finally, we have a local chapter of Blue Shield, which brings together heritage institutions like libraries, archives, and museums to also protect this heritage in case of emergencies. But how do we connect all of these? Obviously, in many practical ways. One of the interesting developments of the past 3 years or 4 years is all that has happened after the Curaçao Climate Change Policy Assessment was initiated in 2018. This policy assessment has finished at least one phase where there's a report on climate change in Curaçao, and the team that worked on it recommended creating a mechanism that includes stakeholders in designing national plans of mitigation and adaptation. This, in turn, has led to a Curaçao climate change platform, and the platform is supposed to then execute that work. The platform has a vision which states that by 2030, Curaçao will be resilient to the adverse effects of natural hazards and the losses of biodiversity due to climate change, and be a key player in renewable energy. So obviously 2030 is the same year as the Agenda 2030. So the climate change platform is working with the Sustainable Development Goals and will include these in the execution of their plan. For their work plan, they are looking at several different areas, and one of those areas includes culture and world heritage sites. This whole development of the Curaçao Climate Change Platform feeds into another project, which is the development of a national strategy and plan of action for disaster resilience and recovery in Curaçao's cultural sector. Long phrase, and it means that we're looking at the national risk reduction strategies and how those can include the cultural sector, just like SEDIMA is doing or is providing a network, a framework to do the same in the other islands of the Caribbean. This project has just started, and it will be connecting with the climate change platform by being one of the working groups, probably the first working group to work out a theme of the climate change platform. And basically, the project entails having the cultural sector and having the risk reduction and risk management sector talk to each other. We will be inventorying the cultural sector to see what exists in the sector and what needs there are according to the sector of risk reduction and risk management. And we will talk to the risk reduction and risk management sector to see what their framework is and what they see as logical steps for the cultural sector and how to include the cultural sector within a national risk reduction strategy. The project consists of two consultations with the cultural sector, two with the risk reduction sector and the cultural sector together, and a workshop to bring this all together into concrete strategies. This should then put the cultural sector and risk reduction sector together on a track for the SDGs. When we look at all of this, when we look at how culture, at least in one way, has been incorporated or is being incorporated in risk reduction, and is being incorporated in the achievement of SDGs, we need to be looking at the general framework. Again, what ideas do we think other ideas with? We need to be paying attention to local reality as an integral, intersectoral, living, and practiced reality. When we look at the local reality in this manner, then we need to remember that local reality is not first and foremost tied to international programs, conventions, agreements. But those international programs, conventions, and agreements do frame a lot of what needs to happen on the island. So there is a very important space for translating that international framework to local needs, something that has been happening in many, many ways since 2015 with several initiatives, but also several moments of evaluation and restructuring, to which we will come back in a few seconds. There are, for us, a few precautions and a few experiences that we need to pay attention to and that might be useful on our path to reaching the SDGs. These include especially what I call projectile planning versus strategic planning. Projectile planning is we have tremendous resources, great ideas, and we shoot them like a missile into the thing that we want to eliminate or what we want to create. And we've had a lot of experience with projectile planning in the past in Curaçao. One of the powerful things of the trajectory of SDGs is that there has been systematic approaches to planning how we can reach those goals. But we'll look at that in a second also. If we resolve the issue of projectile planning versus strategic planning, that will also inform something that is key in how to reach those goals. One of the things that we have done in the past also is capacity building that becomes providing information to individuals and developing skills in individuals, which is very important. But then if you prepare an individual with all this new knowledge and all these new abilities, and this person goes back to a structure that does not have the finance, does not have the time management, does not have the vision, to use these abilities and this new knowledge, this person will not only be sidelined, but also become frustrated eventually. So there's a very important aspect of building institutional capacity and building interinstitutional dialogue that needs to be incorporated in our planning. And again, a lot of this has been part of the efforts of implementation of the SDG trajectory. But it keeps being important to think of how to accomplish this, because the strategies of doing capacity building that I mentioned are not only issues that we need to deal with. There's a general issue internationally, globally, with capacity building not necessarily being focused on institutions and interinstitutional dialogue. A lot of it reverts back to individual capacity building. Other issues that we need to look at include logical integration of processes and coherence in implementation. And I won't spend too much time on those, because one of the strengths of this week is that both these issues will be tackled. And finally, we need realism and constant evaluation of and monitoring of what we are doing, where we're at, and what we want to achieve. And again, this is another issue that will be dealt with. Both this and the previous issue will be taken in stride, I would say, by the SDG Academy. But within that context, it would be useful to always think of the historical framework and the historical legacy that we have. There are things that we can learn from our history that remain important at each step, at each level of implementation of our programming. Just to think of history in terms of SDGs, it might be interesting to remember that 2015 was not just the year of Agenda 2030, but it was also the year of the Paris Agreement on climate, the creation of the Sendai Framework on disaster risk reduction, and leading up to Habitat 3, which was the gathering where sustainable cities, especially, were discussed. So 2015 was a whole framework that has affected a lot of different things that we do locally, that now we focus through Agenda 2030 and we focus it through the SDGs, but there are things that are outside the SDGs. There are processes, strategies, resources, focus points outside the SDGs that relate to the SDGs, but might have been started from a different point of insertion. And because they were started from a different point of insertion, they might lead a different path from a unified path with the SDGs. Also, part of our history is a report of the General Accounting Services, and this was in 2019, where they concluded that there is a serious risk of not reaching the SDGs by 2030. And very concrete issues were presented in the report, most of them structural issues and issues of attention to process. But since this was done in 2019, there has been space to make improvements and to change direction. And several things have been done, including a more robust collection of data, but also a clearer dialogue between stakeholders. But it makes a lot of sense to not forget what has been presented in the report, not just because it created a vision of what still was not done, but because these issues link to wider issues in the Caribbean region. And some of these issues repeat themselves in the region, and there are strategies and practices within the region that we can learn from, and the region can also learn from what we have done in the past and are doing right now. A further piece of global context is that a lot of the current SDGs have been analyzed in so many different ways by so many different people. The slide you're seeing is from Spangenberg, and he has talked about how some of the SDGs are very concrete and very well presented in terms of targets that needs to be reached. Some have targets that are not very clear, and some don't even have targets. And if we look at our own reality and how we have worked with implementing the SDGs, some of the SDGs that do not have concrete targets are problematic for us too. And we need to understand that part of the problem is not just that we need to create the right structures to deal with these SDGs, but part of the problem is that the SDGs themselves have not been defined in a smart and strategic manner. So that when we build our structures, when we create our implementation processes, and when we create dialogue within stakeholders, that we need to understand that we walk with broken legs in a certain sense with some of these SDGs. So a general view of what the SDGs offer concretely in terms of targets is warranted at this moment. And more recently, some of the issues that have affected how SDGs can be implemented include the pandemic. And this is a global view of what the pandemic might imply for SDGs. And it's not a good picture. But knowing that, having seen what has happened in the pandemic globally and having seen what has happened here, we are able to develop and define strategies that both take into account the COVID-19 pandemic and take into account the resources that we have. And part of it is to be navigating management and creation. By this I mean managing the process of implementing SDGs, like what will be happening this week with the Academy, through concentrating on policy coherence and to concentrating on monitoring the SDGs and achieving the SDGs. That's part of management that's crucial, because if we don't do specifically those two things, we will not be able to reach the SDGs. And part of what we need to do is to also expand. For example, if we look at policy coherence, there is coherence outside of current policies also. As we look at developing policy and expanding policy and deepening policy, we might be looking at issues that have not been covered up to now, such as how the cultural sector can be a player in risk reduction itself, but also in achieving SDGs more generally. And one of the lessons from the sector of what now is being called living heritage, which used to be called intangible cultural heritage, is that we are not, we should not limit ourselves to protecting our present, to protecting our future, but to also create our present and create our future because we do have the resources. And creation obviously is something that is big in the cultural sector, but creation within the cultural sector should imply also, if the cultural sector becomes a full-fledged partner in risk reduction, risk management, and achievement of sustainable development goals, part of its sharing, part of its strength, and part of its contribution will be for us to be able to translate in everything that we do, in the processes that we create, in the um, institutions that we create, and the dialogue that we um, create between each other, that we translate these SDGs into what do we already have locally and what is it that we need locally. So all the things that we always say in strategic planning, but taking into account local reality much, much more clearly. As an example, I can talk about how microfinancing is promoted on the island, and a amazing set of initiatives related to microfinancing that's happening, but not at all connected to some, which is the local microfinancing that has happened for at least a century and probably 2 centuries. How can we leverage that knowledge? How can we not simply look at what Sam has done in the past, but to actually learn from how Sam creates social relevance, how social investments are made through Sam, how community trust is built in a system like Sam, how people have to plan ahead, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 3 years ahead, to be able to get the money that they need, which means creating a community that not only can talk about its needs, but can plan and manage the path to get there. And this has happened in our community for 200 years. It's not something we need to reinvent. But if we listen to what is happening in the community, then that will be part of our strength instead of part of the invisible reality that we have. And for me, the most important message that I get from the processes that we have been in already and the processes that are happening now and starting now is that we need to listen with local ears to the framework that is global. We need to walk with local feet in the path that has been created by all of us in this world in 2015, where we said that if we don't take action, we will not have a future. And if we don't take action locally, based on our local history and culture, we might not be able to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ansano, for, I think, this very informative and thorough presentation, keynote address. I think, as you pointed out, very important issues. It was interesting for me to see the linkages on the cultural heritage, education, disaster management, and the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. But additionally, you enlighten us and showcase several recent efforts and endeavors done by several local and Caribbean regional institutions. And for me, it was particularly interesting to see the climate change assessment mentioned, and also subsequently the establishment of the climate change platform. Already in our chat box, we have been getting requests from people that I think are very interested to joining and connecting these dots for the climate change platform. You mentioned institutional framework, very important, tied to local needs, but also the importance of building capacity. Essential concepts that you mentioned that we have to take into account are realism, evaluation, and also monitoring. And I thank you very much for mentioning and promoting our initiative this year on the SDG Academy, where we will focus on two topics, on policy coherence, but also on monitoring and achieving the SDGs, how to do that. I really enjoyed when you took us back in time in 2000 and reminded us of the importance of the year 2015 as a milestone year, I think, also for the kickoff of trajectories on sustainable and resilient development. As you mentioned, the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, but also Habitat 3. It's very significant to build structures. As we have seen in Curaçao, we have done it very well in the past, but it's also very significant to determine smart targets that are relative to our local reality and our context. I thank you very much, Mr. Ansano, for this very, very informative keynote address. And I think right now we will go into the more interactive part. And I think we have some questions in our Q&A box, and we would like to, maybe if you can answer them. Okay. We have our first question. It's from Mr. Joost from Clifford Rosa. He says, good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Ansano. As part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, how do we need to work together in this? Is your advice also good for the other islands as Aruba?
I would first thank Clifford Rosa for his question. I think certainly there are many issues that are similar between the islands, and I believe that there are also important reasons for us to work together. If I just think of, for example, the issue of hurricanes and how hurricanes affect the islands, I go back to the training that has been done on intangible heritage on the Dutch Caribbean, and each island has done inventories of how to deal with emergencies and how each island has dealt traditionally with emergencies, from fishing to mangroves that protect the coast, to how fishermen deal with corals or not deal with corals. Also, what kind of trees to plant, not just for hurricanes season, but also to draw up more water from the ground. So this kind of information, this kind of local knowledge, should be shared between the islands, because we have similar ecologies, we have similar histories also that have created the situation that we have. Because part of the situation that we have is not just related to an ecology that just sprung up. Our ecology has been severely impacted by our historical actions. So yes, first of all, working together and learning from each other, and to also have a very clear and savvy view of what structures we need to set up to be able to work together.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Ansano. If I can maybe add to that, that part of our job also as the SDG Secretariat, we're working together since last year after our first SDG Action Week with the other secretariats of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We're working together with Aruba, St. Martin, but Curaçao, of course, and also the Netherlands. And I think we'll try also to be helpful in this part to also connecting the dots and sharing the knowledge. So we'll be in touch and how we can be of support to this initiative. Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Marcus, there was
Yeah.
another question, but I
Yes.
think it's shifted to the answered.
Yes, correct. But I think
because
it hasn't been answered. But this discussion is from Mr. Joe Squeer.
Yes.
Is asking those challenges to the SDG implementation. That survey was done in 32 countries and resulted in threat percentages. How are these threats percentages in Curaçao?
Yes, and I have those challenges from that study, but I don't have that information for the local situation.
Okay. Yes, maybe it's then we can then later on share the challenges from the study that we can share that with Mr. Squeer. I think that will be the most we can do. And afterwards, if there are other questions from Mr. Squeer, I think he can contact you also for, personally, if that's all right with you, Mr. Ansano.
Yes, he can contact me, certainly. Some of the information that he seems to be asking for probably resides more with the government than with me, because I don't have the local statistics.
Yes. There was also, when you were mentioning the exercise of connecting the dots on the climate change platform, we got a general question of in our chat box of people that would like to participate in that initiative. How can they participate? How can they contact you or contact the climate change assessment platform? Can you maybe provide us with some information or maybe email address they can send their information to?
Sure. There are two things. The climate change platform is looking for people to staff the working groups of the different teams, and for that they should contact the meteorologische dienst, and they will be able to work with the climate change aspect in general. And if people are asking specifically about the culture and emergency working group, they can contact me through email or by WhatsApp, whichever way they prefer. My email is RICHENEL, and I'll put it in the chat.
Yes, I think that would be best. Yes.
Yes. Actually, that's much better. I'll put it in the chat for everyone, and that is specifically for the culture aspect of dealing with emergencies, and for the climate change, they would need to contact the Servicio Meteorológico.
Okay, thank you for that. We still have some time left, people. So if there are any questions or remarks, things you want to state, we can still do that. In the meantime, yes, Mr. Ansano sent this email. You can check it out in the chat box. In the meantime, I would like to remind you that tomorrow we'll have two sessions. We have a session on the Roundtable for Prosperity, and our keynote opening address will be done by Mr. Richenel. And then we'll have an overview of the VNR process by the SDG Secretariat of Curaçao. And then we'll have an interactive session with stakeholders. That will be from 10 till 11:30 in the morning. And afterwards, in the afternoon, we'll have our first session on the SDG Academy. What Mr. Ansano was very glad to. We're very glad that he promoted this very well in his also in his presentation. And our first topic will be on policy coherence for sustainable development. That's going to be from 2 o'clock till 3:30 in the afternoon. Speaker will be Mr. Javier Bronfan. He's an SDG integration advisor for the Bureau for Policy and Program Support for the UNDP. On September 29, Wednesday, we'll have our second roundtable that will be on the people pillar. It will be from 10 to 11:30 again. And we have two opening addresses by Ms. Meryl Griffith. She's coordinator of the NGO report and Federation Antillean Youth Care. And also Mrs. Tamara Salzbach, who is a children's rights expert. And of course, we'll do also another presentation on the VNR process. In the afternoon, we don't have a session, but then we continue on Thursday, September 30th. We have our last roundtable from the Planet pillar from 10 o'clock to 11:30 again. And keynote address will be then from Mr. Filomeno Marchena from the University of Curaçao, but also from UniTwin. And on the afternoon, we'll have our second session of the SDG Academy. And that session will focus on monitoring, achieving the SDGs. Also, again, by Mr. Javier Brunfram. The session will be from 2 o'clock till 2:30 in the afternoon. And on the last day on Friday, we'll have our session for the Youth Commission and Youth Empowerment. That will be the kick-off of the first session to work on the establishment of an SDG platform for the youth of Curaçao. Okay, going back to the chat. I'm not seeing any more questions. Maybe going back to Mr. Ansano, maybe some last words that you want to say to our participants before we close.
Probably my impression of the whole process is that a lot has been done.
Yes.
A lot still needs to be done. There are some serious structural issues that need to be taken care of, and there are probably some resources that are that can be shared with the region and that should be shared with the region. If I think of even a place like Jamaica that has an amazing setup that I've seen,
Yes.
there are things that we learned in Curaçao that would be useful for them, and that in turn will strengthen us also as we share them. I think, for example, on a very small session that we had of making an inventory of cultural heritage in Kingston, and just knowing that people had traditional ways of building their houses, and that some of these traditional ways were very important for preventing major damage during a hurricane. That for me was very, very useful. But then it was useful for them to hear how some of the traditional houses here were constructed in ways that made the house cooler inside. And for them, that was important outside of the hurricane season.
Yes.
So that interaction and that sharing is important, and that's a very small issue that has nothing to do with this big framework of SDGs. But
Right.
if we look at SDGs in a similar way, I'm sure we will find strengths that we built through the process that has started in 2015 that sometimes we don't pay attention to because we already know them and we don't see them like someone from abroad would see them
Yes.
as a strength, and to also to be truthful about where we do have issues of structural weakness that we need to take care of and take into account. But all in all, I think having a process that has already lasted 6 years, um, it's important to do the kind of thing that is being done this week, kind of looking back and also looking at ways of strengthening the process, and to really listen both to the region and to the local reality.
Yes, that's very nice. I think that's a very good conclusion. As you mentioned, very a lot of things has been done in the last 6 years on the process. For instance, in Curacao, we have done a lot, but still we're not there. And I think also the world itself. You know, you mentioned Jamaica. We know that Jamaica has been making very positive progress on the SDGs on the topic on data. That they're very as one of the key players, and but we are trying to do that. We have also a national statistical commission that is working on the data and on the indicators for our priority SDGs. As you can see in my background, these are the 6 priorities SDGs for Curacao: 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, and 14. So, but that doesn't mean that we're not working on the other SDGs. For instance, on SDG 6, water management, we have a lot of going on water management and wastewater management. And as you mentioned very thoroughly on the climate change, we are doing very much as SDG 13, climate action. A lot of it done. We have already the climate change assessment, and we also have the platform. But that will mean that we also bring that in our reporting, for instance, to the voluntary national report due next year, 2022, that we manage that Curacao has now a chapter in the report that we can report on our progress. That was not the case in the report of 2017, but I think right now we made some very major steps in improving that. I see that there one participant has his hand raised. It's Mr. Manfred van Vechel. Mr. van Vechel, do you still have a question that you wanted to ask Mr. Ansano? Can you please maybe put that in the chat box very quick, or has it been answered yet? Or hasn't been answered yet? Maybe if you could, I can ask you please to maybe lower your hand so we know that this is then the case. Yes, in the chat room? Okay, let me check. I hope, yes, I see it. I hope the SG sector has the information base, especially on the information database.
Oh.
No, this, no.
Mr. Martins, I see there's
Yeah.
in the chat, there's another piece. There's a question of, is there any initiative on tourism?
Oh, I don't see that question. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yes. Okay.
Yes, and I have no idea on specific initiatives on tourism and SDGs, as I have not really been in the sector for a while. I don't know if there's any information that Mr. Martis might have on
Yes,
this.
maybe I can answer yes. Now I see the question. Yes, specifically, there's not an SDG that specifically tackles tourism. I think some of the SDGs tackles tourism, but in our start and the kickoff as the SDG Secretariat, we have teamed up with, for instance, the Chata Sustainability Task Force, and also with JCI on several initiatives regarding tourism. So there's a partnership going on. And for instance, when there's initiatives on for instance, with the local diving schools, etc., we try to promote the SGs also with the Curacao cleanup. We try to be part of that. So there are some initiatives based particularly from that sector, coming from that sector, and we try also to embrace and engage with them. So that's the that I can answer on the initiative on tourism. I hope that answers Mr. Manfred van Dakel's questions. Let me check again if there are any more questions. I'll also consult with our technical secretariat here. I see them nodding their head. There's no more questions. So we also arrived at our time, 11:30. I will thank Mr. Ansano again, and also from that very, you call it, you did the translation loosely and very well. Applaud you for that, but also enlightening us that the presentation was also Papiamento, you show us also that important part, important cultural part. And this is our kickoff, SDG Action Week 2021. Don't forget to check our Facebook page and also go on our website, www.curacao2030.cw, and our Facebook page, just let me click, is SDG Curaçao 2030, and also our Instagram. We are on social media. You can also follow us, the sessions, either virtually via Zoom or via Facebook, or also via the Facebook of the Ministry of Economic Development. I thank you for being part of this kickoff of the 2021 edition. And hopefully I will see you, other moderators will be on the other sessions, but we hope to see you virtually in the other sessions. And for instance, for the SDG Academy, the roundtables, and of course, our ending closing session with the youth. Thank you, Mr. Ansano. Thank you, participants, and have a lovely day. And we'll see you tomorrow back virtually in our next session on the SDG Action Week 2021. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In September 2015, world leaders agreed on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, at its core. The agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, prosperity, and peace, accomplished through strategic partnerships. The mission is to improve people's lives and transform our world, and leaving no one behind in the process. Curaçao remains committed to achieving the SDGs. The government approved the roadmap for SDG implementation to foster the sustainable development of our island. Have you thought about what kind of world we want to leave behind for our future generations? Do you wonder how far we've come and what actions we still have to take to achieve the SDGs by 2030? The second edition of the Curaçao SDG Action Week is the platform to share your ideas on implementation of the SDGs in Curaçao. Join this virtual event from September 27th to October 1st, 2021. Participate in a week of inspiring roundtable sessions on the people, planet, and prosperity pillars. Contribute with your valuable input to complete the process for Curaçao's Voluntary National Review, VNR, and share your input on how to accelerate and implement the Sustainable Development Goals for Curaçao. Join us also for the SDG Academy, where we will discuss interesting topics with an international UNDP expert. And of course, don't forget to join in at the final event with our youth. The Curaçao SDG Action Week is organized by the Curaçao National Commission for the 2030 Agenda, facilitated by the Government of Curaçao. Mark your calendar from September 27th to October 1st, 2021, and join us virtually for the Curaçao SDG Action Week 2021. To register, visit our Facebook page, SDG Curaçao 2030. For more information, visit our website, www.curacao2030.cw. Feel free to get in touch with us through Facebook, Instagram, or any of our social media platforms.